We are back. Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program Jeet Heer, national affairs correspondent for The Nation, host of the weekly Nation podcast, The Time of Monsters, and also somebody I spent quite a decent time with, an enjoyable time on the Nation cruise last December. And just before we get into stuff, Jeet, I'm not sure, I want to get your response on this. The CDC has laid off all of the cruise inspectors who, incidentally, aren't even paid by the U.S. government. They are financed through a fee from the cruises because, of course, like the cruises are like, it's not in our best interest to have norovirus run rampant.
And get sued or something.
Or just like,
Yes.
I mean, that's like one of the concerns when you're on a cruise, right?
That's right. Yeah. No, I mean, absolutely. And there was actually, I think, in the early COVID days, I mean, the cruise ships were like a kind of major kind of problem and carrier of the virus and spreader of the virus. I mean, basically getting a lot of old people together in an enclosed space, unless you're like watching out for viruses, you could have trouble.
It's not so great also when you, because a lot of those cruises are more like family friendly. And I got news for you. Based upon what I did when I was a kid and what I see my kids doing, there's not a lot of hand washing at the key times. That is a problem.
Yeah. No. I mean, well, I don't know. I mean, this is like totally in keeping with, our new RFK Jr., you can wish away the measles, world, let's bring back polio.
Well, one of the things that we found that causes autism is washing your hands after you go to the bathroom.
I mean, it's unnatural. It's unnatural.
You can wash your hands after number 2, but not number 1, and that's what gives autism.
Yeah. Well, in any case, yes, that is
more poop talk from Sam.
Okay, so
constant.
I mean, the cruise stuff, because I do go on these Nation cruises, and my family and I were talking about it, because one thing is, we're not sure if we want to go back to the United States, at least for the until the next presidential election, because it's and actually Canada. I'm in Canada, and my government has issued a travel warning. Saying you might want to be aware of certain things if you're going to the U.S. So I think getting rid of the health inspections on cruises, not a great thing. Safety in boats is actually important. As it happens, I was reading a really great book called How to Survive the Titanic by Francis Wilson, which is about the owner of the line that ran the Titanic, and they made certain mistakes. They basically thought the ship was unsinkable, so you didn't need so many lifeboats for every passenger. And the takeaway I took from that book is that when you're dealing with ships on bodies of water, safety first.
Yeah, I'm definitely into that. All right, well let's get your perspective on what we saw this week. Donald Trump launches a trade war with astronomical numbers, and this really, I guess, happened last week. Astronomical numbers of tariffs across the board. Then all hell breaks loose, particularly in the bond market. I mean, the stock market drops, but it seems to be the bond market, which is what really scared the Trump and the administration. And so they rejiggered the tariffs. They increased the tariffs on China up to 125%. They decreased the tariffs on just about everybody else, but to a 10% across the board. So from an inflationary perspective, or from a tariff perspective, it actually increased tariff rates, but somehow it's being reported now as he paused it all. No, he just paused the distribution, the initial distribution, and redistributed. This one could be more inflationary based upon, we get a lot of our products, or a decent amount of our products from China. give me your perspective.
Canada is America's biggest trading partner.
And
so
yes,
you have 125% on your biggest trading partner. And the two economies, I mean, it's not just trading. The two economies are actually integrated, like to a degree that people, can't even contemplate. So
Right.
it's a big deal. And that's why I think the stock market only had a brief respite, right? Like it's kind of rocky again. But I also think I think it's, don't get caught up so much in the details of like one day tariffs are this, the other day it says. It's more the instability, right? Like nobody knows what the hell this guy's going to do. He doesn't know himself. He's flying by the seat of his pants. And I got news for you. Like, people who are doing business, they like certainty. They like having some sense of if you're going to open up a factory.
Wasn't that the big words? Like 15 years ago, wasn't that the only thing that we kept hearing during the Obama years was like, the business community is, needs more predictability, more certainty, and there's no clarity. And so they can't. No,
absolutely. I think that Trump operates on a different level, partially because of the type of business guy he is. He is, as they say, the art of the deal or whatever. But I mean, there's a certain, he thinks advantages he can get from being seen as unstable. And in fact, I mean, one of his defenders, hedge fund billionaire Bill Ackman, says, it's a great strategy for people to think you're crazy. And I actually have to say, I don't actually accept that. I actually think people like stability, especially if, and you mentioned, stock market. Okay, the stock market, it's like unequal, but like a lot of people are invested in the stock market. It's like, through pensions and whatnot. But historically it goes up and down. But where the real sort of stable money is, and it's much more like the real big money is in the bonds, right? That long-term treasury bonds, 10, 20, 30 years. And that is where the story has been. And basically the Wall Street Journal reported Trump was like willing to risk a recession, but not a depression. And so once the bonds started going, now usually, okay, one has to understand, there's the big economic fact is that going back a century, the United States has been the safe harbor for money in a time of crisis, right? You might remember, back in the 20th century, we had 2 world wars.
I heard about that.
Deals. And in those 2 world wars, the nations of Europe, for really no good reason, destroyed themselves and also destroyed large parts of Asia and Africa. What this meant was that the United States, protected by these 2 oceans, even though it participated in those wars, it was not bombed. Its industrial base was kind of safe. And this meant America was like the secure place. And the American dollar, even before it became the global superpower, was the secure place to put money for investors when things get hairy, right? And that continued even after the 2008 financial meltdown and even after COVID. And that has been a great advantage to the United States, to be seen as the safe harbor. Because what that means is if the United States needs to raise debt, needs to borrow money, needs to deal with a financial crisis like 2008 or COVID, it always has a ready access of money because money is willing to pour in. That gives the U.S. a great deal of government, a great deal of freedom and leverage and power, right? It's a good thing to have. The U.S. is the reserve currency of the world.
Let me just add this so that people understand. And as the United States currency is the safe harbor, Treasury bonds have been the safest harbor within that harbor.
Within that, because the Treasury bonds are the sort of,
The U.S. government has never, and by bonds, basically what it is it's the U.S. government is being loaned money, essentially, and provides an interest rate in response to it. It's generally low, but not too low. But it's generally low because it's so not risky. So you can buy a treasury bond, which is essentially loaning the U.S. government because the U.S. government needs to borrow money. And it's a very safe investment, not a huge payoff, but a safe investment you can count on, or at least it has been. We have never, ever, ever defaulted on a treasury bond. There's never been a time where it's like, okay, my bond is matured. I want my money. And the U.S. government said, we can't pay you. We've always been able to pay it. It's been the hallmark of the financial bedrock of the United States.
of the United States and by default the world, right? Like going back a century. It used to actually be the British pound was the default currency back when the British Empire was a thing. But once the British Empire fell apart, like, nobody wanted to thought that the pound was a safe harbor. And the US and so what traditionally happens is like in a time of crisis, if the stock market goes down, people move their money to people who are the big money. And you have to understand, like if 60% of the population has like pension funds in the stock market, the people who hold the treasury bonds are literally 1.3% of the population. They are the 1%, right? This is the 1% we're talking about. And a lot of these are actually governments, like governments around the world. The Chinese government, the Japanese government, the Canadian government hold American treasury bonds as a safe
Social Security.
Yes.
Also, we should say, holds a lot of treasury bonds.
That's right. So like it's now what Trump, and they were actually expecting this because this is something that Scott Bessant and Howard Lutnick said, which is they said, well, if the stock market goes down, that's actually good for us because people will move their money into treasury bonds, and then that will actually allow us to lower the rates on treasury bonds, and so we have to pay less interest on our debt, right? That is normally, and that's not a crazy thing for them to have said. That is normally what happens. But what happened this time, the person to read on this is Adam Tooze, who's a great economic historian at Columbia, and who on his Substack chart book, you should have him on. He explained all this earlier this week on a post on Monday. But basically, what happened this time was both the stock market was going down, but also people were, and basically it was the governments of Japan, Canada, and the EU. Not so much the Chinese, interestingly, although if they are one of the big holders of treasury bonds, and if they decide to take it out, that would cause a lot of trouble. So people were taking money out of the treasury bonds, moving it somewhere else, right? And now if they say people are like calling in their treasury bonds, then the rates of that go up, and every 1% it goes up. That's I forget the exact numbers, but it's something like 600 billion.
Each point is $300 billion in each debt. And let me just let's just explain this too, because this I mean, I'm projecting, but this has always been rather opaque to me, and so I just, as people are listening, when there's more people who want to buy bonds because things in the stock market are bad, I need to put my money in something safe and hold it there, and I want to get some interest rate on it. I'm not going to put it in my mattress, but I'm going to get some interest rate on it. The more people who go into bonds, the cost of the bond itself goes up, but the rate of return drops because everybody wants the safety. And we're going to give you the safety. It's going to cost you a little bit more, but the returns are going to be a little bit less because you're buying safety.
Especially if it's longer maturity as well. Right. Yeah.
And when those rates go down, because everybody's buying bonds, everybody wants to lend me money. Okay, I've got a lot of competition who I can lend the money to, so I can lower the interest rates because there's more demand. That's interest on our debt. And so as a government, we want those rates to be low because if people are going to borrow us money at 2% instead of 4%, that's good for us because we don't have to service the amount of debt that we have to service.
No. So basically, people. So once the people are taking money out of the treasury bonds, the amount of money that the U.S. government owes was starting to rise quite dramatically. And you have to understand, Trump has a larger program, right? Now we have $1 trillion spent on the Pentagon. He wants to have tax cuts for the wealthy. So imagine a situation where you're both going to explode the debt, to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy, and the borrowing is going to become much, much, much more expensive, and people actually aren't going to lend you the money. So imagine you want to take out 2 or 3 more mortgages on your house, but you also decide to pour graffiti all over the banks and decide to piss on the banker. That's not a good move because the banker will just suddenly either deny you your mortgage or just raise your rates, right? You do not want to be in a position where you anger the people that are in an actual position of power to really screw you, which is what Trump did. Now beyond that, we're really in a different position because there's a quote from the Deutsche Bank, or the German central bank, I think, basically saying that we are now in a period where we're heading towards rapid de-dollarization. So it's not just a treasury bond issue. Now, de-dollarization is something people have been talking about for decades.
Yeah.
It's actually people on the left. This is like, a sort of Marxist analysis, basically saying that the American position in the world is unsustainable. That as it becomes a smaller part of the world economy, it can't be the reserve currency forever, and you're going to come to a point where the American currency is just a regular old currency, and therefore that will limit the power of the American state to like borrow and have the free hand that it did. Now, that was going to happen, but it's going to happen over like 10, 15, 20 years, right? What Trump has basically done is like accelerated the process of de-dollarization so it could happen very rapidly, like at a period where there is actually going to be like some real, fiscal problems because of the tax cuts he wants. And this actually also explains some of the Doge stuff, right? Like they basically are imagining a scenario where, they might have to slash a lot of the safety programs that people are used to, a lot of, the entitlements basically. So this is a very dire situation and it's a real crisis. And it actually, there's some talk. Some of it this is all speculative and some of it might be fan fiction, but I'm seeing some people talking about how basically, Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, met recently with the Japanese and the Europeans. They had a big meeting a couple of weeks ago. And what people are thinking is that, one of the things they talked about was coordinating
selling a U.S. debt.
Yeah. Because they knew that if they did it together, did it at the same time, it could cause a crisis.
So, and
that's just speculation.
Well, that's the thing that's interesting about this. And I just want to say, in terms of the de-dollarization, I think we saw that with the, I think it was the Swiss franc and the French franc, I think, shot up, at least in Europe. And then also the yen shot up a little bit. So that's where you start to see people essentially buying those currencies as opposed to U.S. currencies. So this question,
it's those countries that met that's where it's happening, and it's not so much. People were really worried that China was going to, push for de-dollarization, and they could at any time, but they've been a little bit more cautious about this.
That's because one of the things that has been sort of like provided that security of the dollar being, the currency of the world, as it were, was how enmeshed China and the U.S. were with each other, where it was like China doesn't want to disrupt this. They're growing and they're functioning with this regime as it exists now. The timing of this is probably not what they would have wanted necessarily either, frankly.
I think as I said, I think de-dollarization was going to happen. I don't think there was any way that it could have been stopped. But I think it would have been better for everyone if it happened gradually. If it was a process where both the U.S. and the other countries could adjust to a world where the American currency was a regular currency. But now, if you have rapid de-dollarization at a time of sort of like fiscal crisis and, like debt ceilings and all this stuff, like the U.S. becomes much closer to, Argentina or Brazil, where, like you could really see the international financiers playing hard and fast and really pushing them into a crisis. Or Great Britain is actually another great example because they were like the U.S. They were like the world empire, used to having their own way. And then at a particular point, like with the Suez crisis, the American government decided we're going to pull all the gold out and their currency went into crisis, or more recently with trust, right? So the U.S. would actually become like much more vulnerable to like outside shocks. And just like, but it makes a much more unstable world.
But China
makes, hurts the whole economy. It hurts everybody. There's nobody benefiting from this.
No, but China would benefit from de-dollarization if it happened gradually, right? Go ahead.
Yes. Well, wait a second. You're saying nobody's benefiting from this.
Well,
I want to play a clip of Donald Trump in the White House with a bunch of stooges. I don't know who these people are. They're lined up. They must be like Trump his servants.
Unfortunately, Whitmer is in this room, by the way.
Oh, it's
Gretchen
Whitmer in there too.
She got a bunch of flack for this.
And he is introducing to his staff Charles Schwab and saying, like, you thought it was just a company. It's actually a person. And some other guy. Who do we know who the second guy is? Schwab and one other guy. So
like Colonel Sanders.
You say everybody's losing, but not everybody's losing.
No.
Here we go.
This is Charles Schwab. It's not just a company, it's actually an individual. And he made $2.5 billion today, and he made $900 million. Because, he's in financials. I've always been following.
So if you couldn't hear it, he's saying this is Charles Schwab. It's not just a name, it's not just a company. It's a guy. He made $2.5 billion today, and he made $900 million. Now, you know who else seems to be in a pretty good mood? Donald Trump. I have a feeling that Donald Trump probably also did not miss this opportunity to capitalize.
There was a spike in sales right before he made this announcement. So there's clearly some insider trading there. I mean, from AOC to Adam Schiff, they're already calling for investigations.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I don't deny this insider trading, and these guys can make their hundreds of millions or billions, but we're talking about like the global economy of trillions of dollars, right? And it is a kind of soprano situation where if you take over a restaurant and burn it down and collect the insurance money and strip it clean before so you can sell off all the furniture. Yes, you're going to be making money, but does this actually help the economy? The economy.
No, exactly. This is an extraction play, and they are just pulling all that value out of every little crooked nook and cranny they can find.
Yeah. Well, which is the Trump? Yeah, this is Trump. The second
presidency.
This is what they're doing. They themselves are personally trying to profit and strip everything they can. But the big picture is this is a huge kind of disaster on a world historical scale. I'm trying to think of, when was the last time there were economic decisions of this catastrophic? And, I mean, it is the one that people always mention, which is the Smoot-Hawley of, raising tariffs as the Depression was starting and sabotaging the world economy.
That was almost 100 years ago, incidentally.
He's also obsessed with McKinley, so it seems like that's very deliberate. Before we move on from it, I just wanted to make this one zoom out for a sec just to make this point, because as we're talking, China does benefit from a de-dollarization, but doing it gradually, right? As they begin to make their economic footprint even larger, although they are the number one, exporter in the world, but we are the number one consumers of the world. That's what these trade deficits are, right? That's what they indicate. They indicate that we have so much wealth in this country that we're able to consume all of these things, but people don't see their material conditions improving. And I do think that that's what Trump taps into here, or what hopefully the Democrats can do, is because he's capitalizing on the idea that people fundamentally understand how much wealth there is in this country, but they're not seeing it in their day-to-day lives. It's going to get worse with this protectionism, but we have to acknowledge that there's all this excess wealth here that he's gesturing towards with the tariffs at the very least.
Yeah, no, I think I'm really glad you made that point, because it is kind of essential that the economy's been out of whack for a long time. There's a sense in which some of these policies, gradual de-dollarization, maybe even a lower dollar would also make America more easier for it to export. Try to using selective tariffs in a strategic way to build up industry. All of that, I think, is plausible. But I mean, Trump. One of my colleagues at The Nation at a meeting just described him as a sort of bizarro leftist, which is that he's taking all of these ideas, these are Bernie Sanders ideas, but implementing them in the worst possible way, and basically with what we said, the sort of self-dealing and sort of enriching his friends, but with likely I'm already seeing sort of catastrophic results. But I mean, and I know the people who are talking about wanting to have a nuanced position on tariffs, like Sean Fain, the UAW, he's gotten a lot of flack, but he just gave a speech and I listened to it. And a lot of the stuff that he said is very similar to what Emma's saying. And it's very sensible stuff. We cannot, if we make it just a choice going forward, it's Trump's craziness or a return to the status quo. I mean, I think they can win elections on that, given how bad things are going to be. But I don't think that's a productive politics. I don't think that's going to like solve anything.
I want to come back to that point, put a pin in that for a couple of minutes as we go through some of these other topics, because that notion of where do Democrats, where do separately, like progressives, social democrats, democratic socialists, the whole, what do they need to do in this moment, to set up for what looks like some opportunities down the road. But before we get there, I got one more question on the bond thing, just to see if you've read anything about it, because again, a lot of this stuff escapes me. There's two things that could have been going on in terms of like the what was happening with the bonds. One is there could have been a lot of these countries who were subject to these tariffs decide either because they've coordinated or because it's a natural reaction, we're going to sell and we're going to be the so-called bond vigilantes and force the U.S.'s hand. We're going to cause a panic. But there's also another theory out there that some of the selling of these bonds looked like a liquidity crisis. That there were people who were not selling these bonds to send a message, but rather they were selling these bonds because there were margin calls in the equities market.
Stock market. Yeah.
And there were other sort of like, maybe there were derivatives, maybe whatever it was, maybe there were hedge funds with that were selling these bonds because they need cash. And that is, when you need cash, you're looking around at your assets. Where am I going to get it? Well, you can sell bonds like that. And also it's the one that has the least opportunity to grow big. So that's the first place you look for cash, essentially like your savings bank. I don't know how to parse that out. And I'm not sure that anybody does, but
no, I've actually been like trying to look into that, because trying to figure out if this is like, now that some of it is other governments. Like I think it's pretty clear that the Japanese government and some of the Europeans and Canada are doing a little bit of this. And I don't think it's not the case that the Canadian government is like, owes money to a loan shark and has to sell bonds. And we're not that bad yet. But somebody, I mean, I think it could be both, right? Like I don't think it's mutually exclusive. And both kind of make sense. Like and in fact, I think it's the nature of the crisis is always like a domino effect, right? So it could be like governments are losing faith or want to try to leverage, but this also causes a panic. And I mean the stock market is like, and the bond market, like people talk about like market logic, but these are like sort of like irrational things governed by fear as much as anything else, right?
Right.
And when they do panic, they panic a lot. So I think that I would suspect we'll probably like need someone like Adam Tooze to like parse out what degree it is. But I think both are happening, and I actually especially think I want to emphasize like governments in Europe are actually talking about de-dollarization, and these are like long-standing American allies, like the Germans especially. And the Germans, I mean, there's two things. One of his lessons of the last century is don't make the Germans mad, right? And just try not to do that. And I think that the Germans are quite upset, and they're not just upset about like the tariffs stuff, but going back to the Zelensky and how Trump treated. I think that the Zelensky moment in the Oval Office, that was like a real like wake up call. Like, oh my God, like this guy, we cannot trust him. And so a lot of like governments around the world, and a lot of bankers and serious, like not I'm just a Twitter clown, right? But like a lot of very serious people are thinking like we cannot rely on the United States anymore.
Look, they gave us a mulligan. They gave us a mulligan the first time. But when you start doing this again, like that you've signaled to the world that they're honestly. We have signaled to and I frankly think we did it the first time around, but we signaled to the world as a country that we are not the country we used to be in terms of, it's one thing. It is one thing. And I think probably the world government was, the rest of the world's like, they don't really care whether we get health care or not at the end of the day, although that may have been short-sighted. They don't care, whether we're, the government is a democratic socialist or a social democrat or neoliberal government. It's just the stability, the predictability. And we just basically signaled that we're off the rails. We're not, we didn't get back on the rails. We're off the rails.
Like, it takes a lot to get people to distrust the U.S. government and not see it as a safe harbor. Because, as I said, that being the safe harbor was built upon the facts of the 20th century, the big, wars of the 20th century, in which the U.S. emerged really as the, safe, stable place in the world. Just piss that away and to lose that, that's a lot, right? And
that's a big deal.
Again, you can kind of see that. It wasn't just like Trump. There's been a couple of occasions where the Europeans have had doubts, but whenever a Democrat comes in, they think, okay, things are back to normal. So it's I actually think go back the early 20th century, 21st century, with Bush and the Iraq War and the housing meltdown, which destroyed the world economy. There are a lot of people in Europe and in Asia who are very mad at the United States. But once Obama came in and brought some grown-ups and some responsibility, they thought, okay, we can trust the U.S. Yeah, Trump again, which, Trump the first time scared people, but then, you had Biden coming in. But once you elect Trump, this is the third time where you have an American president that is going to try to blow up everything up. And at that point, we finally reached the point where people have had enough. They've given, it's like you have an alcoholic or drug addict in your family, and you love them. You give them a chance, right? Go into rehab. They go on a bender. They happens 2, 3, 4, 5 times. At a certain point, people kind of say I gotta wash my hands of you, right?
Yep. All right, let's just turn briefly. It is it's now almost 1 p.m. Supposedly at 1 p.m. today, a judge is going to rule on whether Mahmoud Khalil, who Columbia student, who was the communications person for the folks who were protesting, pro-Palestine protesters who were protesting at Columbia and or anti-genocide. Now they dovetail. And he was picked up by ICE officials. We know this from a video that his 8-month-old pregnant wife.
Now 9. He's been in jail he's been detained for a month. I don't know if she's given birth yet.
He was basically disappeared. Didn't know where he was for a couple of days. Ended up in a facility in Louisiana, if I remember correctly. The U.S. government was given until 2 days ago, Wednesday night, to provide evidence that he had done something. Remember, he's here legally. He's got a student visa at the very least, maybe a green card. I'm not even sure. Green card. And here legally, and some evidence of a crime that would justify his revocation of his freedom. Apparently, the U.S. government could not come up with one. So Marco Rubio just wrote a letter saying his belief system is hurting foreign policy.
Yes.
I'm not being facetious. When I say that, that's what the substance of the, the letter to me looked like it was being written for a third party. It wasn't to impress the judge. It was to impress Trump supporters, to make it look like we're doing this and to scare maybe other people too. So we'll find out in an hour. But we also now have the Supreme Court last night said, the U.S. government, you admitted that you sent a wrong person to this gulag. It turns out that 90% of them, now it's reporters have reported on 90% of the people we sent to this El Salvadoran gulag, ostensibly because they were gang members or whatnot, 90% of them had no criminal record. And we don't even know if there's any, I don't know how you prove if someone's in a gang or not, but, tattoos, obviously.
Yeah. Which
the
is like,
presence of tattoos, or
70% of
also
young people.
hoop nose rings. I
Right.
don't know if
Yeah.
people, but you wrote a piece about the McCarthyism that is
Yes.
that is growing, and we've watched university after university basically be threatened with getting grants revoked unless they make some deal. We've watched these big law firms capitulate, and the Trump administration's response: we want a consent decree to make sure that Colombia is actually going to basically police anti-Semitism. And I put that in quotes because it's absolute garbage what they're talking about.
Yeah, no, I know. It's pretty terrifying stuff. I mean, as you said, my piece, I sure try to frame this as part of a longer history in America of these kind of like crackdowns on so-called subversive or like anti-American speech. There's a Red Scare like during World War I, and a Red Scare in the late 40s, early 50s, and now with pro-Palestinian speech. The common pattern is, which I wanted to emphasize, they all start with kind of like liberal administrations. It was like Woodrow Wilson, Harry Truman, and Joe Biden that like kind of initially started this idea that there are these people who have bad thoughts, are foreigners, are like un-American, and they build the infrastructure, like of legal persecution, and this, especially with the sort of McCarthyism, and now gets taken over by the right. It actually gives an opening to the right because you're playing into already right-wing fears of the alien, the foreigner. So I mean, liberals, when they talk about McCarthyism, they talk about this is like a Republican thing, right? Like Joseph McCarthy, this bad Republican senator, right? Like, but it's actually like Harry Truman that like built all the sort of loyalty tests, the purge of the civil service, all the sort of Red Scare rhetoric, which allowed like McCarthy to come in, and the only difference was Truman was like really aiming at like real reds, and then McCarthy said, well, we can apply it more broadly, right? Like because it's liberals are also communists, and so this is a way in which the sort of centrist Democrats, liberal Democrats even, they consider themselves like Wilson, Truman, and Biden. Basically, they are giving a license to the far right, and they are actually empowering the far right. And I think that that's the pattern that people have to realize. And also another pattern is that liberal institutions, like are not able to defend liberal values. Like when we think about liberalism, like philosophy, like like I think it's something we all kind of like can believe in, right? Like representation, democracy, free speech. But these big liberal institutions, the big law firms, the universities, during McCarthyism, the same thing. They voluntarily purged themselves before McCarthy came along. And now the like Colombia was already, because of donor pressure, was doing it. And one is basically seeing is a kind of I mean, I think a lot of it is frankly the Israel lobby, which is very enmeshed with the national security state, trying to push back public opinion in a period where public opinions actually change, where there's a poll from the Pew, 53% of Americans now have a negative view of Israel, and that includes 50% of like Republicans like under age 49. The only like group that is a strong majority, strongly pro-Israel now are old Republicans, basically boomer Republicans, right? If you look at like Democrats, young Democrats are hugely anti-Israel or critical of Israel, 70-80%. But even like older Democrats are like 60%, right? They're lagging, but they're catching up. So basically, they're trying to use the repressive power of the state and of like finance in these institutions to push back the tide of public opinion in a period where public opinion is like radically shifting. And maybe that's a difference from McCarthyism, because I actually think McCarthy was able to appeal to a widely shared anti-communism.
What happened to popularism, though? By the way, I've been told that the Democrats should embrace popular opinion in policy, except on Israel.
I actually once had an argument with David Shore on Twitter about this, because I mentioned, like, if you look at the polling, like, maybe they should pull back on Israel. And he kind of, he said something like, well, there are other considerations on this issue. And then he deleted that tweet. And so
I hope you took a screen grab of that.
Yeah, I did it. I kind of like kicked myself for that.
Somebody can find it.
I gotta find that. Yeah.
But let me ask you this. I mean, because I think, there's two things here. One is, in this specific era, there is no doubt that the crackdowns by the Biden administration and sort of like liberal society, as it were, on these protests. I think also this sort of like, we can see this, the anti-Semitism, the charge of anti-Semitism is justifying a whole host of things way outside of in addition to the charge of anti-Semitism being problematic, but this is
no. We're seeing this as anti-Semitism as any criticism of Israel, which is itself
right. And I'm saying that in itself is also, but outside of the realm of anti-Semitism, it's empowering this administration to do things like, deport immigrants and to jail immigrants that, because once you say it's a belief that harms foreign policy and it's justified through, well, it's anti-Semitic and we support Israel and blah, blah, blah. But once you then generalize it to it's a belief that undermines the U.S. foreign policy, well, then it's off to the races. Like this is in that process. Just go a little bit deeper for me in this process, because this notion of once you open the door in a liberal administration to this, what is being done? Like, because there's a lot of times where people are saying we should be nuanced about this. And, but your argument is if you're not maximalist in some of these things, then you're opening the door and leaving essentially like, I don't know what the metaphor is here, but you are open. Well, you've opened the door a little bit, and then it's a lot easier just to push it wider open, I guess. How does that work? Well, how does that work?
Well, I mean, the way it works is that the fundamental premise is already kind of reactionary. The fundamental premise is that, which the Biden shared. I mean, when Biden was saying like these students are like violent and anti-Semitic, I mean, just on the factual issue, like Spencer Ackerman has done some good reporting on this. Like almost all the violence on student campus came from like pro-Israel people. There might have been a few small incidences otherwise, but like it was really, but beyond that, and on the anti-Semitism thing, I mean, like I really have to say, like, we have this group called Stop Anti-Semitism that says, who's that children's entertainer?
Miss Rachel. I mean, this is the most. We have so much to cover, but this has been one of the most insane stories. Miss Rachel is like one of the most popular children's creators on the internet for young children doing instructional videos. She's beloved by all parents. It helps them out. She has been she's been making videos for the kids in Gaza, and you see them being shown it as they're surrounded by rubble. Dirty, right? Like they have such little to look forward to. And the Stop Anti-Semitism people are accusing her of being a Hamas supporter and anti-Semite. It's
No, I mean, it's
insane.
Literally saying like Big Bird and Elmo are pro-Hamas. I mean, like this is like the level we're getting at. No. But I think this basic thing where Biden kind of opened the door. He basically made incredibly incendiary comments. One could also say all the kind of like lies he said about beheaded babies and whatnot. Like basically that was like red meat for the right, because they could kindly say like someone like Trump basically says, there are these horrible like anti-Semites and threats, and you're weak. So he basically goes, Biden says he's going to defend you from these horrible evil hordes, but he can't defend you. I'm actually the tough guy, the strong guy, the guy that'll deport you. and will defend you. There's the same with Joseph McCarthy. I mean, McCarthy basically said, well, Harry Truman is saying there's a big communist threat, but he's not doing anything. They're still communists. Whereas, like, I'm actually going to like name all the communists and I'm going to deport all the communists. Now, so you're already buying into the scaremongering logic that terrifies people. And I have to say, like, even beyond this, and I think the best person that expressed this was Jewish member of the State Department who resigned from the Biden administration, where when she resigned, she said that,
Lily Greenberg
I will never forgive the Biden,
Okay. Lily Greenberg Call?
Yeah, Lily, yeah, exactly. She said, I will never forgive the Biden administration for making Jews the face of the American war machine. Yep. And this is exactly what's happening, because this is what people need to understand. And this is why I don't really like I mean, there's an Israel lobby, but it's really something much bigger than this. It is the American war machine, the American imperial machine wants a revenge and domination in the Middle East. And they are using Jews as human shields to justify this. And I find that morally unconscionable. And I have to say, like, if you want to like make more anti-Semitism in the world, that's what you do, right? Because this will absolutely make people associate Jews unfairly with like these horrific crimes. And like the other aspect of this, like one of these groups, I don't know if it's Stop Anti-Semitism or something very similar. Like they did like this, like showing this picture of these forged protests at Columbia, saying, these are people who need to be blacklisted, and they were all Jewish students.
Yeah,
Basically, you're using like fighting anti-Semitism to basically suppress the Jewish left. I don't know. I mean, I just think it's a very sordid thing, but it's something that like very cynically Biden and I have to say Chuck Schumer, they started it, and they handed over weapons to Trump. And one sees the same process frankly in Israel, where like a lot of the things that we really are against in Israel, like the settlements, they were all started by the labor governments. Like the labor government created a repressive apparatus, and then someone like Netanyahu could come and say, well, but they're not doing it effectively. If you want to really effectively build settlements and repress the Palestinians, you need a strong man, and I'm the guy. So like in a lot of ways, I think the liberals have empowered both Trump and Netanyahu.
This dynamic and moving off of that particular example of it, I mean, just to wrap things up, because I did want to talk to you just slightly about abundance, because we never got an opportunity to really discuss that much. But this dynamic of when you accept a premise and attempt to nuance it in certain instances by accepting the premise, then all of a sudden you've moved in outside of, let's say, a policy thing. And you've moved into a political, to the realm of politics. Like I've told this story many times before, but I first met Alex Lawson of Social Security Works years and years ago at Netroots Nation. And when George Bush was trying to privatize Social Security, I think there was a bunch of people who were saying like, our slogan is, something like, and this is probably not exactly what it was, but fix it, not privatize it. And I'm like, wait a second.
Yeah.
When you say that it's broken, which it's not, Social Security was not broken. I mean, at that time it was, the trust fund was funded until 2032, incidentally. Now it's like 2034.
Social Security is one of the great achievements of American civilization. I mean, that is
when you say that you're going to fix it, you're conceding it's broken, and now all of a sudden it just becomes a debate as to whose idea is better to fix this broken thing. And that's what you're talking about. Once you concede the reactionary point, you're going to lose out to the really reactionary revanchist people, when we're talking about that McCarthyism, because you're talking about cracking down on dissidents? That's my jam. You guys are rookies.
Trump has a good point. Like, if you really want to repress the Palestinians, he'll do like a much better job than Biden will. Like,
he's out there saying that Chuck Schumer, who has publicly stated, my job is to make sure the left continues to support Israel. Trump's out there going like, as far as I'm concerned, you're a Palestinian.
Yeah, you're not a real.
I mean, so I mean,
well, unfortunately, that's another case where Chuck Schumer has failed.
Oh my God, miserably.
And actually, I mean, the other place we're going to see this actually is China, because a lot of Democrats are doing like sort of China saber rattling, and that just thinking that's like kind of smart politics. And that's just gonna like
no, you're just opening the door.
Everything we're saying, you could sum up very simply: you give them an inch, and they'll take a mile.
Right. And that's the politics. I mean, that's just sort of like a truism when you're talking about politics. And then the question is like, how do you introduce sort of like mini narratives? How do you fiddle around like policy situations? Like use Social Security as an example. Okay, how do we fund it past 2032 when we're having this argument 20 years ago? Well, the answer is get rid of the cap. And you don't talk about Social Security being broken at all. You don't ever say those words. It's the same way with the tariffs too, on some level, I think, because, saying the tariffs are good in this circumstance, they can be good, but it's like saying like what he's doing is not using tariffs in the way that they're meant. They're just a tax in this instance. Yeah. Well, so with all that sort of said, talk a little bit about abundance. Like what is that? Explain to people, because we had a thing where we've been we had Paul Glastis on to go through the sort of like the specifics of what is laid out in abundance, and not so much the overall sort of complaint. And we've done a couple of like comments on it, just more based on the interviews that those guys have done. And I'm curious at your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, like in theory, like it sounds great, and I actually think that it's there's an actual thing that one wants liberals, especially in the U.S., but I think also in the world to do, which is to be thinking about like building things. Like I think that the sort of like if you're putting it forward, like in the early 20th century, you had these big, huge projects like the Hoover Dam, the space program. Let's get back to that. Now, I think the problem, so I think that there's like this sort of analytical aspect of like, thinking of it in terms of like, an emphasis on production rather than just regulation, right? And I think it is absolutely true that there's a type of liberalism that's too focused on like just getting the rules right and the regulations right, and not thinking about like an actual project. So I'm very sympathetic to that. Having said that, like any political project involves alliances and working with people, and it is absolutely the case that like with the abundance thing, like we actually have like these memos from these like libertarian think tanks saying like like abundance is a way that libertarians can ally with the centrists to like push our agenda in the Democratic Party, and one sees it in the way that some of these abundance center left or liberal people like Ezra Klein, they seem much more friendly or inclined to make alliances with these libertarians than they do with like the left. So like to me, like that sends off like sort of like alarm bells. Like like are they taking like a real problem, like how do we build more housing, and then using it as a stalking horse for just as the way that like the Russiagate stuff had some legitimacy, was a stalking horse for the people like the Cheneys to become legitimate again. I think abundance is really a stalking horse for the Koch brothers and others to gain a foothold in the Democratic Party. And I think on that level, the political level, like one has to take it seriously. And when you raise these issues, they always say, "Oh, you're not talking about the policies." Well, I'm sorry, but these policies aren't coming out of nowhere. There's a reason why everyone's talking about abundance, is because like these billionaires are putting a huge amount of money into these think tanks to promote it. All these guys have agents. Like there's an actual political project going on, and we have to address that.
This is what I'm getting at in terms of like this dynamic, because it is one thing to say we need to get to a place where we are producing more and building like we used to build. Yeah. And the question is like, who's the we in that instance? That's very important. we as a society, and the question is within that, like who's doing the building, who's deciding what we build in those instances is really important. But the other is that you cannot, in our society, maybe there was a time this was the case. I don't know. I don't think so. A policy exists within the context of our politics.
Yes.
And that there is no set of policies that, frankly, you or I are going to read about, unless it's like, like we've had people come on this show who, they're in I don't know what press it would be that their books came out. And maybe one or two people have reviewed it in like other sort of obscure, and they have policies and they're doing this and they're creating policy ideas. But that book wasn't just a series of policies. That was part of a political project. I mean, that's the thing, is that it's not that whole thing there has implications beyond the narrow sort of
policy prescriptions, which are and they're kind of playing dumb a little bit about that overall effort to make it a political project, which is sketchy to me.
No, I mean, I think that's a very dubious aspect. I mean, on the more broader issue, like I actually think economic growth has kind of been a problem going back to the early 70s. Like the capitalism has not been as productive as it has been. And a lot of these solutions that are being offered have actually already been tried. Like deregulation was tried, and it juiced up things to a certain degree, but then everything goes back to the mean. And so I don't, I think it's good that we're talking about this. I think this is a core fundamental issue. And, like what I always tell them is like, well, you want to look at an abundance agenda, who's doing it well is Chairman Xi, because they're building like crazy amounts of like high-speed rail and electric cars. And, like if maybe we should take some lessons from that.
That could very well be. We'll be there. But that's well, I'm waiting for that book.
We gotta look at all the models. We have the Koch brother model, which we've tried that a little bit. There are other models for this problem of like actual productive growth. And in some ways, I mean, I think the productivity argument is actually a good way to go after Trump, because like a lot of this stuff of cutting science funding is absolutely bad for that.
It's all extractive.
It's all extractive. You actually need like a sort of
hostile takeover stuff. This is like is literally like what Bain Capital does, right? They come in, they buy the country, they start selling off everything they can, they over leverage it, they extract the value out of it, and then walk away.
That's right. Well, I mean that's the model, and so I think like offering an alternative model, but I mean I think any sort of alternative model has to be much more state-centered, frankly. I don't think that a lot of the problems that we're facing, especially with climate, there's the capitalism has kind of already proven that it cannot deal with these problems.
Absolutely.
For the simple reason that like the technologies that we have will they'll break even, but they will not make the profits that fossil fuel will. So
what Trump is doing right now is also an example of just of capitalism. Failing, just the half-hearted, the tariffs obviously are imposed by the U.S. government, but just having tariffs will do nothing to build an industrial base. It will not at all. And it just simply won't. I mean, it might help the existing.
I'm with Biden on this one. I think some of this Biden stuff of Build Back Better was getting towards where we need to be. It's just that he screwed up everything else so badly, and he was not capable of selling this. But I mean, if you want an abundance agenda, the other aspect I'll mention is the abundance agenda in terms of the politics. It really is designed to counteract the Bernie framing of the enemy, to say that we have an oligarchy. These are the people who are standing in the way of an abundance agenda. The oligarchs want all the money for themselves, so they're not willing to do the social investments we need to make a world of human flourishing and abundance. And that's like Bernie's argument. And I think a lot of the people like Ezra Klein are trying to preempt that and have a feel-good story where everything is better, but not quite explained. where this is going to be coming from.
Yeah, I agree. Jeet Heer, always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, Jeet.
National
Yeah,
Affairs
great fun.
correspondent. We will we will link to your articles and of course to your podcast, Time of Monsters.
Thank you.
Hey folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.